Bonjour à tous. Thank you for dealing with such delightful melodies as that. So welcome to our 2024 Philosophy and Political Theory Colloquium, which is hosted by the Department of Economics, Philosophy and Political Science here at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. Those are all, of course, things you're familiar with. My name is Philippe Garner, and it's been my pleasure and responsibility to co-organize this event with my fellow assistant professor, Catherine Craig. So events such as these, they're here to allow us to bring distinguished scholars to campus, at times virtually so, but still bring them to campus, and so they can share their thoughts, make their arguments, and engage with faculty and students. Last year, some of you may recall that we had the pleasure of hosting Christopher Coots from Berkeley and Brian Oren from Waterloo to talk about the ethics of war. And this year, fortune smiles on us again. We have two great speakers, Carol Gould and Mark Warren. Carol Gould is a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science at the City University of New York, also known as CUNY, as well as the director for the Center for Global Ethics and Politics at the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies. But most relevant to today's event are her writings on democracy, namely her books on democracy, such as Reinventing Democracy, 1988, Globalizing Democracy and Human Rights, 2014, and Interactive Democracy, 2014, all of which were published with Cambridge University Press. Mark Warren is a professor at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, that is to say the other campus, in the Department of Political Science, as well as the holder of the, is it Merrilees Chair, Merrilees Emeritus Chair for the study of democracy. And again, most relevant to today's event are his writings on democracy, namely his books Democracy and Trust, and that one's with Cambridge University Press, if I'm not mistaken, and Democracy and Association, that one's with Princeton University Press, which I note was the winner of the Elaine and David Spitz Book Prize, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? All right, so please brief join me in giving guests today. All right, praise, no flattery. So just a few words on the event itself. I want to point out a few things about the format so you can follow along. You don't feel totally lost with how things are going along, and a quick note about the recording and decorum. So momentarily, Carol's going to open her 90-minute session. That's the time she'll have for both her talk and the question and answer period. And she's free to use as much of that 90 minutes to talk or as much of it to answer your questions and comments and objections. We might take a short break after she delivers her prepared remarks. After Carol's 90-minute session or 90-so-minute session, then we'll have a 20-minute or so break. You're welcome to help yourselves to the catering at the front or go to the washrooms or whatever. You're adults, conduct yourselves as such. I think that's quite understandable. After that break, we'll be 1500 approximately, and then we'll have 90 minutes for Mark, the same format. After the prepared remarks, the other speaker will have the right to be the first one to comment, and then it'll be the general floor. What I'll ask is that people come to the microphone to speak. That way we can get you on film and we can hear you. We'll turn the microphone on during the Q&A. We don't need to hear your whispers during the prepared remarks. And just a quick note about the video capture. So we're trying our best to do this in part because we feel that we shouldn't let these events go unnoticed, and what the EPP is doing here at UBCO should be something we can share afterwards and document. So I just say, please speak as clearly as you can into the microphone when it'll be your time. But also, while I encourage and welcome trenchant criticism and combativeness, intellectual combativeness at least, please just do so in a respectful way. So as a rule of thumb, it's very simple. If your grandparents were to watch the recording later on, you should aim that they be proud of how you intervene and not ashamed. I think that's a very easy, intuitive rule of thumb. Again, you're adults, conduct yourselves as such. But anyhow, I've talked for already too long. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Carol to begin her remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I'm a little bit ill, but I should make it. I'm about to share my screen. Is that okay? Yeah. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I would love to come at some other point. Good. Okay, let me begin. So the topic of my talk is the missing element in democratic theory: democracy, economy, and family in an authoritarian age. Oh, sorry. Uh-oh, it's not advancing. Okay, I have to do it this way. That's pretty inconvenient. Let me see. Okay. We live, as you know, in dark times for democracy. That's a reference to Hannah Arendt's title, Men in Dark Times, which included a bunch of women that she also reflected on, in which she wrote about the period in the first half of the 19th century. As in that period, we now face a growing threat of authoritarianism, along with considerable divisiveness, if not also violence. Perhaps especially of concern to me is in the United States, although it's not unknown in Canada. A large number of undemocratic and anti-democratic governments around the world have emerged and strengthened with strongman leaders in power in the United States and abroad. So here I have a bunch of these, I hope you won't mind, philosophical cartoons. So in case you can't read it, he's saying, my goodness, if only I'd known how badly you wanted democracy, I'd have given it to you ages ago. You can't hear the laughter, but that's okay. And here is and now the globalization of nationalism. Le Pen, UKIP, Trump. This I just threw in. One man, one vote. Isn't that what I've been doing? Okay. I like philosophical cartoons. But my argument in this paper is to the effect that current proposals to protect democracy, especially in the United States, are of two types. There have been calls for institutional reforms and calls for more civil discourse. But I want to argue here that both of these are inadequate, although they would be useful. So the institutional critique and the proposal for institutional reforms points to how the current form and even the founding documents of US constitutional democracy and in other cases as well, but to a lesser degree, they enable minority rule rather than the majority rule generally agreed to be a key element of democratic decision-making. So people point to the undemocratic nature of the Electoral College and the US Senate, the lack of an explicit right to vote, the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, gerrymandering, lobbying, and the power of corporate interests. Correcting these flaws, however challenging, is the main direction, these people argue, for protecting and realizing democracy. So here's another cute one. Well, gentlemen, that wraps it up. Are we forgetting anybody? And here is an interpretation of the people that the Supreme Court advanced to include corporations, as you know, with the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United that they have the right for free expression, like natural persons. This one's obvious. Money bags there. Big oil buys Congress, gets Keystone Pipeline. The 234 yes votes got $42 million behind them, and the 193 no votes got $8 million behind it. So the power of money. Oops, sorry. These little people don't have a list of demands. How can we know what they want? As you can see, they're sitting on all those little people. Okay. Some of these are only modestly funny. Here's the Koch brothers. Russia's subverting US democracy, and we hate competitors. Thank you for voting. See you again in 4 years. So this is the problem, that voting is about the only form of expression that people can effectively make in politics. And even that is, in doubt, because there's no protection, even for the right to vote in the United States. Anyway, second, another tack is taken by those who call for civil discourse to remedy the polarization which currently afflicts our politics. But how can that be done? So there are proposals for civics education in schools and calls for more compromise among those holding divergent views. There are calls to turn down the volume or to limit participation in social media. However, given that these calls have been going on for many years with apparently no effect, indeed with an exacerbation of the polarization, this sort of tack seems inadequate as it stands, although we can agree that more civility would certainly be welcome. This guy is in class saying, expect you all to be independent, innovative, critical thinkers who will do exactly as I say. Think for yourself. And they say, make me. And here is, what's that noise? We're entering blogosphere. So democratic theorists, and a more sophisticated and important version of this view, have introduced plans for opening opportunities for deliberative democracy. For example, mini-publics and citizen assemblies. And these address the lack of representation and manipulation by politicians or parties. And there have been many important innovations along these lines in Europe and in Canada, and perhaps you'll hear about them later today. But the resistance to implementation, there's resistance to implementation due to the power of political parties, lobbying interests, and politicians. And given voter apathy, it's not clear how many would take up these deliberative opportunities. Perhaps they would if their deliberations made a real difference for policy, as in some of the innovations that have been introduced. But that in turn comes up against the existing powers that be that don't want to give up any of their power. So while I agree that this is an important direction, I don't think it suffices. Instead, to address the growing authoritarianism and the dangers to democracy, I think we need to step back a little in order to consider some of its elements, of the elements of this authoritarianism and the way it is currently being produced and reproduced in the United States and elsewhere. A compelling empirical analysis is beyond my scope, but we can highlight some factors which the above two strategies, that of institutional reform and civil discourse, cannot address. And to my mind, this suggests that new directions for thinking about and protecting and realizing democracy are required. Unfortunately, these new directions are also rather visionary, but I want to suggest that elements of them can be implemented now. So, as has been widely observed, contemporary ultranationalist movements that support authoritarian rulers express grievances against a host of minorities, including especially migrants, Blacks, and Jews, all of whom they tend to blame for their situation in life. They are most often male and display patriarchal attitudes concerning women's roles and the division of labor in the family, as do the women who participate in those movements. They tend to be nativist and critical of government authority, which they see as interference, as well as being critical of corporate elites. They may complain of emasculation and humiliation, sometimes extending to justifications of revenge against those blamed for their plight. So we're clearly in a period of reaction, in part, against movements for civil rights, women's equality, and LGBTQ+ rights. And in parallel with the left, we can observe there is a criticism of overreaching government, for example, with its surveillance, inefficiency, overseas wars, and of entrenched economic power. Yet here, with the authoritarian movements, it leads not to demands or movements for greater equality, but to nationalism, isolationism, and most problematically, sometimes to racist, sexist, and anti-immigrant sentiment, and even occasional violence. So, despite the importance of reformed institutions and democratic innovations in politics, my thought is that they do not yet address the root causes of our crisis, and especially the feelings of powerlessness and humiliation that these movement members display. This should be along with their claims to power over others whom they regard as subordinate. How to address the root causes of these feelings? We need to look outside politics. We have to address structural injustices and not only institutional injustices of the sort I began with. And in what follows, I want to focus on two forms of structural injustice, those involved in capitalism and in patriarchy, and consider their impact on democracy, and then propose some needed transformations. And I'm unfortunately going to have to leave aside for now the important additional dimension of structural or systemic racism. So, structural injustice, conflicts of capitalism and democracy. So the idea of structural injustice has been reintroduced into social and political theory, especially by Iris Young, building on a Marxist background. And in her understanding in structural injustice, the social practices that we engage in have oppressive consequences, which are often unintended by those involved in these practices. People are shaped by these processes and reproduce them in their everyday experience in economic, social, and political life, but especially in social life. In my reading, the original notion from the Marxist tradition as applied to capitalism is a little different. In my analysis, it's the very operation of the structure and the systemic functioning of capitalism that involves a form of domination over those who work, such that they must work under the control of bosses and to benefit capital in a self-reproducing cycle. Further, institutional background conditions frame this functioning. So I want to highlight the systemic aspects of capitalism, the way it's framed by institutional background, and not only focus on social practices in their intersection that impact individuals, because I want to argue that it's the very operation of the system itself that is dominating. It's a little different. So here, we affirm the right of the poor to be horrifically exploited. Psst, call it freedom of contract. Pretty radical. A pillar of American ideology, that American here being US, sorry, is a close linkage between capitalism and democracy, or between capitalist markets and freedom itself. But capitalism, sometimes in the form of state-managed capitalism, continues to flourish where democracy does not. We see this in China and in Russia, among many other contexts. So, Turkey. So indeed, capitalist economic formations seem to have been spreading more effectively than political democracy. Clearly, these can coexist, even if only as formal democracy, and they have done so at certain times in the United States and in other economically developed societies, but there doesn't seem to be a necessary connection between them, contrary to the ideology. So this is Duterte. He wins after an incendiary populist campaign. The spread of American democratic values? Anyway. As a system that involves exploitation and domination, along with forms of hierarchy and vastly unequal power, capitalism is not itself a democratic system. Those who are in a position to control the means of life that everyone needs are able to exert power over these others who must agree to work for them within the framework of a capitalist market economy. There's generally no possibility of equal participation in decision-making concerning the specific capitalist structures or institutions by all who work within them. Instead, those in positions of ownership and control have the power to make decisions that others must obey on penalty of losing their jobs and thus their livelihoods. Moreover, capitalist structures function to reproduce and reinforce these unequal power relations. The undemocratic nature of capitalism is not troubling to those who regard democracy as only a mode of political governance. They tend to conceive of economy and politics as separate spheres and construe democracy narrowly as applying only to the former, and moreover as consisting only of free elections and majority rule. When viewed this way, the problem of dealing with the deep inequalities of capitalism tends to be conceived as a matter of the redistribution of wealth and of preventing economic inequalities from subverting the political process and undermining essential political equality. Emphasis is accordingly placed on redistribution through taxation, on establishing a social safety net, and on implementing campaign reform so as to moderate or ideally perhaps to curtail the power of money in elections. It's evident that capitalism itself has undergone significant transformation over the last century. It was both constrained and enhanced through politics and law, constrained by welfare and labor rights regulation and organization, and fortified by other types of regulations and institutions that have helped to moderate the business cycles and ensure greater rewards for capital. It has also taken on increasingly financialized forms and has extended its scope through economic globalization and other aspects of neoliberalism. Yet through all this, it remains a system not only of unequal income, but also of unequal power, including especially the power of decision-making. The various ameliorations of the inequalities and harms of capitalism, though important, do not yet get to the core problem that it poses to democracy, which consists precisely in its fundamentally undemocratic nature. So here we've got the Creativity Corporation, and he's saying, you get back to that goddamn cubicle and start thinking outside the box. The next step in the argument follows from this lack of power. 1 second, please. The next step in the argument follows from this lack of power that capitalism entails for workers and for middle-class people generally, namely its disempowering effects on political democracy. Wealthy elites tend to exert disproportional impacts, as I've argued, by way of their financial contributions and the lobbying carried out for the benefit of the corporations or businesses with which they tend to be associated. Economic globalization has impacted the availability of well-paying jobs for many workers in developed societies, especially given the absence of political correctives, for example, by way of education and job training, adequate social provision, and so forth. With the financial crisis of 2007-8 and the Great Recession then, the disempowerment of large swaths of the US population and elsewhere around the world came to the fore. Policies of austerity, especially in Europe, further aggravated the life situation for many people there. Feelings of disempowerment, especially among low and middle-income people, have grown strong. So this, it seems to me, does have a real basis in economic life and due to the lack of influence, the real lack of influence on politics. These processes have been aided by continuing attacks on the very idea of government itself, advanced by interests aligned with rich and powerful individuals and corporations. Labor unions, too, which had been able historically to modestly represent and advance workers' interests, have been weakened in the United States, and this too contributes to the disempowerment of workers here, with some recent resurgence, happily, that we see. Two additional important factors, though, need to be added to this picture. In the United States, at least, an endemic racism deriving from the slave period and subsequently and before as well, probably, and the long-term existence of white nationalist movements, which blame and scapegoat Blacks, Jews, immigrants, and others for the problems people have. Second, there's been a profound reaction against women's equality by a significant part of the population. All these factors yield a context ripe for the rise of right-wing authoritarian movements in politics. So I suggest it's an intersection of various types of oppression that not on the side, the way it's usually discussed, of the people who are manifest intersecting identities, but on the part of the oppressive groups themselves. There are multiple forms of oppression that intersect with each other and that generate these types of movements or motives for oppression. So in this context, rather dismal context, my thesis is to address the disempowerment that people experience. We need to look beyond politics. We need an extension of democracy to economic and social life, and indeed to what John Dewey called democracy as a way of life. Two key transformations that concerns people's ordinary life activities are required, that is, their life outside the political sphere. And I'll be discussing those in what follows. First, the introduction of self-management or democratic management at work, that is, the development of what has been called democratic workplaces, though I believe that term has drawbacks given global supply chains and global companies. And second, the democratic personality, or perhaps even more demandingly, the cultivation of a democratic personality, which I called it in my Rethinking Democracy book of 1988, or perhaps even more demandingly, an egalitarian personality. I will suggest that this involves the cultivation of empathy and a disposition to solidarity. So there's actually a third element that I should have included there, and it's mentioned on this slide. So my idea is to strengthen democracy by extending it to democracy in social and economic life, and this has been a consistent theme in my work over time. First, the importance of workplace democracy as empowering workers, based on the Pateman, John Stuart Mill, Carol Pateman idea, the practice of participation is educative. We'll come back to that. Secondly, I'm going to discuss socializing care and cooperation in families. And third, the cultivation of a democratic ethos and democratic personalities or characters. And there I'm going to discuss a little bit, very brief mentions anyway, of a notion of empathy, including with distant others, and solidarity and social critique. So the arguments for workplace democracy, I'm not going to go through the main arguments actually today, although I'm happy to discuss it in the Q&A. These are intrinsic arguments that I've developed elsewhere. And just to summarize it, if we understand the justification of democracy to consist in a general requirement that people be able to co-determine the nature and direction of their common activities, their activities in common, where these latter are characterized by shared goals and often take institutional forms, but not necessarily political ones, then forms of decision-making, democratic decision-making, are widely necessary. They would be required in all contexts where people associate in the relevant ways, and specifically within economic and social institutions themselves, and not only in political ones. This requirement is not in the first instance a matter of extending political democracy to apply to economic policy and planning on a broad scale, but rather of introducing democratic decision-making within the range of economic institutions, starting with firms themselves. So this argument really turns on a notion, an extension of the idea of self-determination to an egalitarian direction, such that all who participate in a common activity have rights to take part in decisions about it. But my focus in this paper is more the instrumental justification for democracy in economic and social life, which goes back originally, it goes back to John Stuart Mill and others, G.D.H. Cole and many others. But Carol Pateman introduced this effectively into political theory in her book, Participation and Democratic Theory of 1970, and subsequently in subsequent arguments, where she claims that that participation in decision-making at work is needed for the education that it provides for democratic participation in politics. As Pateman observes, a requirement for worker control accords with John Stuart Mill's observation that the practice of participation is educative. That is, by actually exercising democratic decision-making. You become better at it, you become more comfortable at it, you come to expect it, and this would be beneficial for our politics if we brought to bear these practices of deciding things equally and democratically. And it also, as she points out, resonates with Mill's own late arguments for extending democratic participation to industry, which people don't always know that was associated with John Stuart Mill at the same time that Marx was writing about similar notions. One can argue along these lines that if workers have the opportunity to take part in the significant forms of decision-making that take place in firms, they would learn about and become comfortable with democratic practices and come to expect them in politics at local and national levels. So here are just two quotes from Pateman. One might characterize the participatory model as one where maximum input, that is participation, is required, and where output includes not just policies, decisions, but also the development of the social and political capacities of each individual, so that there is feedback from output to input. And she also writes, the theory of participatory democracy is built around the central assertion that individuals and their institutions cannot be considered in isolation from one another. And as you see, I think this resonates with the feminist insight concerning the need to address the situation within families, interactions among people as a condition for an effective politics as well as themselves being political in the broader sense of the word political decisions. If it is the case that political democracy is being undermined by the lack of democracy in other spheres of life, and particularly in the economy and at work, then certain reforms and broader transformations of these latter fields, that is, say, economy and work, suggest themselves. These changes include mitigating, if not eliminating, the power of capital within everyday work processes and addressing people's lack of a say over the many decisions that affect them. Whether understood in terms of domination or capitalist exploitation, I suggest that employees currently lack the experience of collective self-rule in their economic lives. Even their individual opportunities for self-rule are subject to severe constraints because of their lack of income or wealth, or else through online forms of manipulation by profit-seeking companies, among other interventions in or constraints on their choices. Clearly, workers' felt experiences of powerlessness derive in part from their inability to adequately provide for themselves or their families. But it's also plausible to suppose that for many of them, these feelings develop from subservience at work. Notably, the existing lack of power and control at work have been correlated with health issues for workers, especially in regard to cardiovascular diseases, which tend to be worse in a straight line with how much control you have over your work. The democratic management argued for here need not mean that all workers have to decide everything. Not only would this be inefficient and overly demanding, but it's also not required by the norm. Rather, the claim is that workplaces, even contemporary, more globally extended ones, should be designed or redesigned so as to give workers the power to select managers, with the latter genuinely accountable to them. Various modalities for accomplishing this have been implemented in both co-ops and worker self-managed companies, and these could serve as models for emulation more generally, along with the innovation of new methods of democratic participation. So everybody cites the one viable worker control corporation, which has been, although it's declining a bit now, very, very successful, the sixth largest corporation of Spain, the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. And it's been organized from its beginning as a self-managing corporate firm, actually an assemblage of firms for many decades. Beyond this case, a 2014 census study of cooperatives worldwide conducted for the United Nations found a total of 2.6 million cooperatives worldwide, with over 1 billion members. Globally, 1 out of every 6 people is either a member or a client of a co-op. Should be noted, of course, that some of those are consumer co-ops, however, and not the sort that are central to the present account, but it's still way more than most people think. The impact that democratic forms of management at work could have for enhancing democratic participation turns on the practice of agency that it enables, where this agency is understood not only in individualistic terms, but also as having joint or collective manifestations. In addition, joint decision-making at work could contribute to cultivating people's tendencies to cooperation, much needed. Given that all the workers would have a stake in the success of their firm and see it as dependent on their own collective decision-making, they would likely feel the need to cooperate more and would potentially come to appreciate how such willing coordination and cooperation is beneficial for the success of their enterprise. For this argument for the utility and democratic management and cooperation at work to go through, there's no need to establish a clear-cut analogy between firms and states, where the latter has been considered the proper home for democracy, although that analogy is important in the intrinsic defense of workplace democracy. Here, in regard to the educative value of worker participation, despite some differences between the spheres of economy and politics, the claim is only that if people are allowed to take a more active role in decision-making with others in firms or workplaces, they will tend to feel more effective and in control. Such a practice would additionally likely generate an appreciation of the benefits that can derive from having such relatively equal opportunities to participate and to deliberate with others. These are empirical claims, but studies of actual worker cooperatives, along with worker participation efforts, provide some encouragement for thinking them to be correct. So in the paper, I have several references to these studies. Some studies of cooperatives, moreover, have supported the idea that they encourage greater gender equality and racial equality as well. This also suggests to us a somewhat different model, though, of women's equality than many of the standard ones. So I have a picture of a standard, whoops, sorry. The Committee on Women's Rights will now come to order. I couldn't resist. Here's one of the standard way equality for women is understood. These are, I guess, CEOs, an equal right to discriminate, freedom to exploit workers, male or female. Female CEOs are superhuman too. And he's saying down there, which part of equality don't you understand? Anyway. So now this additional element. This is a section on socializing care and cooperation in families. It'll be briefer than the last one. What is still missing from our account are new forms of care work practices, given their importance for social reproduction. This topic would merit a paper of its own, but here we can only point to some features of what I call cooperative care beyond capitalism. We can take guidance from feminist care theory as well as from the socialist tradition, both of which call for the socialization of care in a post-capitalist society. But I think we can move to these elements now. So it's not just visionary, but there's some elements of this that can be introduced in the shorter term. From the perspective of Karl Marx's own theory, which prioritizes human laboring activity as potentially free activity, we can see, I think, that care work has a similar potential for being creative and being performed in innovative ways, although Marx and Engels didn't necessarily recognize that themselves. We should acknowledge that not only childcare, but even housework can have its creative dimensions, as in the culinary arts, even though much housework remains hard and repetitive, if not simply a form of drudgery. She's saying, keep up the good work, and soon I might grant you limited autonomy. So what would the socialization of care work entail? I suggest that it does not imply a mandate for communal forms of child raising or for direct government provision of child care, although it does not rule those out either. Minimally, it requires fully equal responsibilities of parents for both childcare and housework, and an overcoming of any attribution of fixed gender roles in the sense of dictating them. This would be crucial in addressing the persistence of sexism due to boys' experience in growing up in male-dominated households. Because much of early education in the family involves the children modeling themselves on their parents, a strong role division there is bound to reproduce itself. I'm the one in charge, respect my authority. Yeah. So it's cute. He's going to grow up to hopefully not be a member of one of those movements. In more practical terms, as liberal feminist theorists have argued, properly supporting childcare would require equal and abundant parental leave and serious reforms at work, such as flexible working hours. We can suggest that democratically managed firms, as described above, would conduce to these reforms, since these demands are of importance for mothers and other caretakers. But governmental action and regulation would also be needed. The wide range of care provision besides childcare also needs to be considered here. There are a host of caring professions and organizations, whether for the elderly, the infirm, and others, and cooperative forms can usefully be implemented on all of those. One possibility for more cooperative forms of care provision is adumbrated in the Beyond Care Cooperative in Brooklyn, New York. As discussed by Ken Esty, this co-op of immigrant workers has managed to avoid the standard exploitative practices of domestic work by joining together and using a single contract with employers, with a defined range of pay and with strict provisions designed to implement New York State's Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. Co-ops like these, with an elected and rotating leadership, and where workers are also owners and managers, can bring the benefits of democratic management to the delivery of care services. There are many other possibilities that would need to be explored. Under the general head of socialization, we can draw a useful distinction between public provision and public financing. This applies to care organizations as well as more generally. Public financing can be used without the government being the actual care provider. The particular avenue chosen, whether only public financing or also direct public provision, would depend in part on particular local circumstances. It would clearly be essential to have public funding of childcare, but the care could be provided by co-ops or other forms of nonprofits, as well as by collectives of parents. Thus, the move to socialization in itself involves no implication that governmental agencies must directly provide the care, contrary to claims that are sometimes lodged against socialism. We can note, however, that some European countries, especially the Nordic ones, have implemented effective systems of direct governmental provision of childcare, or at least offer substantial subsidies and allowances. So finally, a brief section on democratic dispositions in everyday life. We can finally observe that democratic management is by itself insufficient for strengthening democracy in politics. Another required extension concerns social life and our ordinary interactions, and can be summed up in Dewey's notion of democracy as a way of life. This relatively unexplored direction would need to draw even more on feminist ethics, including not only care ethics, but also the implications of feminist critiques of domination and oppression, and the concomitant importance of cultivating forms of reciprocity and mutuality in everyday life. If domination or exploitation most often involves control by some of the conditions that others need for their activity, then its opposite would involve equal recognition of others, as well as the cultivation of social relations that are mutually supportive. Feminist ethics has likewise placed an emphasis on care within interpersonal relations, most especially in families and other close contexts, but sometimes extending more broadly, as in Joan Tronto, Virginia Held, Michael Sloat. Beyond this, feminist theorists, but not only them, have highlighted the importance of sentiment, and more recently of empathy, to supplement the traditional philosophical weight on reason for helping to guide social relations. Reason, too, I suggest, needs to be understood in supple ways in which it is attentive to the specific character of the various situations, the contexts to which it is applied. So the question for us is whether these various observations about the role of care and empathy can have impact on politics, and whether they have broad social and political correlates that take them beyond the limited sphere of personal relationships. Although these are expansive questions which require further analysis, we can briefly point to answers in the affirmative here. Clearly, contemporary politics, with its widespread coarseness and meanness, reveals precisely people's general lack of empathy with the situation of others, even of fellow members of one's own community, not to speak of the plight of distant others. Although the individuals who engage in hateful or degrading speech or action towards others may in fact be kind and caring to some of those who are close to them, or even may feel sporadic empathy with strangers, there is what one might call an absence of generalized empathy or of a disposition to empathy. Such generalized empathy would not require an uncritical attitude toward everyone, no matter their actions, but a tendency to conceive things from others' perspectives, and would involve some measure of feelingful identification with these others, whether friends or strangers. In this reading, empathy involves not only a cognitive ability to share perspectives, but also a readiness to feel with others. It also involves some use of imagination in projecting oneself into the situation of another or into their context. I have elsewhere argued that empathy is most effective when coupled with a socially critical understanding of context, including its oppressive aspects. Here, empathy. Clever cartoon. We know exactly how you feel. As you see, you don't have to share everything with the person that you are feeling empathic with. Oh, sorry. How would you like it if the mouse did that to you? Oh, this is the best. Empathy, that's nothing but a code word for compassion. Socialism. The correlate to empathic modes at the level of broader society and politics is, in fact, I think, solidarity. And one of the motivations where you stand in solidarity with others, and I can't go into much of this here, although I've written many articles about it. One of the motivations for solidarity actions with others can be empathy for their situation. In this way, solidarity among groups can be based on a sort of social empathy that the members feel for each other. But another relevant motivation, one that is especially important in politics, is shared interest, which is the more rugged and combative notion of solidarity sometimes necessary. Yet even when interests bind people together in common struggles, effective solidarity actions require a socially critical understanding of the specificities of those one is seeking to aid. I've suggested it involves deference to the perspectives of these others and to the sorts of help that they want and ask for. And it includes some elements of reciprocity and mutuality as well, such that each group is willing to aid the other if the need arises. So it's a form of mutual aid. Here is a solidarity demonstration of Syriza. Solidarity, it's good to have friends. Some more solidarity images. We, the people, must help each other. An injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity is the bottom one. Instead of the big guy gobbling up the fish, the many fish gobble up him. Okay. So in terms of, I'm almost finished anyway, so be eager to hear what you say, what your questions are. In terms of individual motivation, dispositions toward empathy and solidarity can be taught, it seems to me, or at least not untaught, as they often are now. If the experimental evidence is correct that even babies exhibit elementary forms of empathy, the question might more appropriately be how they lose it over time, or in any case, only come to exercise it very narrowly. Despite this observation, it must be acknowledged that it's not easy to learn to generalize empathy or sentiments on a broad scale, or to extend our solidarities transnationally beyond those with whom one shares membership in a specific group or community. However, I think we can get better at doing so, and what is required is not an overly demanding cognitive and feelingful identification with everyone, which would be impossible, but rather the cultivation of dispositions to empathy, solidarity, and reciprocity. This is, I think, achievable through good education, but must be coupled with social support for meeting people's basic needs. Though this latter claim concerning the importance of economic well-being as a condition for generalized empathy and solidarity may seem a surprising addition, adequate ability to meet needs would provide the time and space required for people to be concerned with others outside their personal domain. This brings us finally to the notion of the development of a democratic and egalitarian personality or character. The notion of character is perhaps more apt here inasmuch as it suggests that its achievement depends on practice and practicing. Such a character or personality is cultivated through family life and education, but in a supportive social setting. In turn, I believe that it can lend support to democratic forms of social and political life as well. But what is the meaning of these notions as they apply to ways of being on a small and a larger scale? In short, a democratic personality would involve appropriate forms of activity and initiative on the one hand, and receptivity and listening on the other hand, along with a tendency to reciprocity. It would support not only participatory forms of democratic action, but also deliberative ones, and thus could engage both reason and empathy, as noted above. So I certainly want to endorse all these moves to deliberative democracy as a form of participation. Clearly, sometimes sentiments like anger and indignation are important too, but they would hopefully be led and qualified not only by one's interests, but also by critical reason and empathic understanding. The cultivation of an egalitarian personality is perhaps even more difficult than the cultivation of a democratic personality, particularly if it's taken to require the ability to extend the recognition of people's equality globally. What is needed is clearly more than the rational recognition of each person's moral equality in Kantian terms, however important that may be. It calls for a tendency to see others concretely as equal in their differences, and to take account of the way their situation impacts their ability to transform themselves over time. It requires a willingness to support actions in solidarity with these others and to work in some of the diverse ways required to help them meet their basic needs. While no individual alone can accomplish this, it becomes possible if people act in concert. A reference again to Miss Arendt, as we used to call her when I took her course at the University of Chicago. These concluding reflections, with roots in feminist and critical social theory, suggest for us that we need to look at the way democratic modes of being can exist not only in the economy, but in everyday life as well, in forms of reciprocity and mutuality. These modes, these democratic modes, would need to be cultivated on both large and small scales. It's not surprising that dominating forms of politics rest on forms of domination in the economy and in everyday life. The remedy surely is in part to find ways to encourage equality, reciprocity, and solidarity in all these interrelated spheres. Brace yourselves, democracy is coming. And that's the end. Thank you.
All right, so anyone, the mic should be on. So anyone, if they want to ask a question to Carol, make a comment, raise a devastating objection, you're welcome to do so. So that I can tell there are several students in the room. Don't be afraid. She won't send you an angry email afterwards or contact your professors. I can guarantee you of that.
Correct.
So.
I obviously convinced everybody, so there you go.
I think we have someone finally the ice has been broken, so someone will come and ask you something.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor. It really made me think about all my poli-sci classes that I've been taking. And my question is the following. How big of a threat do you think authoritarianism really is in developed and consolidated democracies? Because even though we've been seeing rises in the right-wing parties, we've been seeing changes in the voting patterns. Not a single party that's actually going for any authoritarian regime has been able to gain any support in Europe or North America. So we've seen parties being in government change, like we've seen in Italy, Netherlands, Germany. Right-wing parties are in power now. But I don't actually see how the points that you bring up are a threat to democracies because of that. And I agree that we should always look for weak points and ways to improve the process of democracy. But specifically in this context, are we talking about authoritarianism or just democratic backsliding? Because we can have democratic backsliding in democracies, but it's really far from authoritarianism. So.
Wow. Okay. That's just mysterious that you would say that, because Hungary has been moving very decisively in undemocratic directions. Turkey, Israel, Poland just reversed itself, but it was heading that way. I originally used to talk about authoritarian populism, but I think that that's too weak, because I actually think that authoritarianism is what is at stake, with the possibilities even of a renewed fascism. I mean, in Italy, the inheritors of the fascist party are now in power, and no, they haven't moved all the way to authoritarianism. It depends what you mean by democracy. If you just mean barely having votes, that still happens. But I also don't identify democracy just with, the suffrage and periodic elections and majority rule. I think that that's too limited a notion, and it's not even clear that some of the elections in question have been free and fair. But I mean, in Western Europe, they are still, but in some of the places are dubious. But democracy also involves an independent judiciary and some elements of separation of powers. The independence of the judiciary was severely compromised in Poland. We're just lucky that it's come back recently, or they're trying to restore it. And then there's the United States, which I would say we are in very serious danger of authoritarian regime coming to power through the vote for various reasons. And these, besides the actual impact on existing states, the movements have grown substantially. There's a very, very large and awful, scary set of white nationalist, ultra-nationalist movements in all of the countries. You may not just know about it, but I don't think you should go hunt it out either. It's very unpleasant and very scary. So I'm just don't understand, and I guess I would just disagree. We'll have to see, but some of the actual developments are towards authoritarianism in the countries I just mentioned.
Would you like to push back? We have time, please, if you want to. You're welcome to.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So
I mean, yeah, to talk about Turkey or, you know.
no, Turkey. I'm from Armenia, so I know a lot about Turkey.
Okay, so is that a model of democratic decision making, would you say?
No, in Turkey, no, I wouldn't say that. But in Western Europe, and that's what I said, in consolidated, developed democracies. And I agree with you completely on the argument that democracy doesn't just mean suffrage; it means human rights, minority rights, and everything.
So discuss Hungary. So discuss Hungary and
Hungary, like Belarus, Hungary, Turkey, those ones I agree with you. But all the rest, like especially Western Europe and North America, I just don't see how authoritarianism is a threat, because all the parties that are in power, that gain any support, they're all democratic. I mean, there was this survey, I don't know, you might have heard about it. It was done by the Fraser Institute last year, when they asked people aged from 18 to 24 if they support socialism. And 50% of the answers were yes. So that was a big headline. But if you actually look into the survey and how it was done in Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, and Sweden, I think. It was either Sweden or Norway. So the thing is that it's not that people actually want socialism. It's just they want more government spending. So
I wasn't talking about socialism by any means. I'm talking about authoritarianism. Socialism isn't the same.
I know, but my point is that there's no support increasing for any authoritarian regime or ideology in democracies that are consolidated.
Okay, well, the United States is a very clear case where there is increasing support for it. The support for, Trump and his movement is growing. And it's possible.
So you have a skeptic. I'm very glad. Thank you for your question, Tade.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I'm very glad we've got students who are capable and confident of voicing their skepticism.
Yeah, sure.
Please just come up. That's what the microphone's for. And then we'll move to Madeleine, who's a fellow faculty member who's online. We'll ask a question, and we'll slowly but surely inch our way towards Mark's response and our break. Please go ahead.
Say one more thing, that I hope that the student is right. That would be great. But the point is that it's not sufficient, because these people have an effect. They have an effect on everyone in social media. The movements themselves have an effect, for example, with all of the bullying that goes on and so forth. So even if it were not the case that there's about to be a takeover in democratic governments, it nonetheless represents a large number of people who support those kinds of intersecting forms of oppression. Okay, just a clarification.
Okay, sure, of course, please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just curious about when you're talking about implementing democratic models in the workplace, and that, I guess, being the means by which people want to participate in democratic processes in society. But if there already is like malaise and like an aversion away from like these democratic principles from these people you talk about, like the working class and the people that are being downtrodden upon, then what's the incentive for these corporations to implement those models so that people, I guess, can partake effectively? Like, would there be like government funding? Would there be like special allowances for these corporations? I just wanted to have some clarity on that.
Yeah. Well, there are a range of models for how this could work. But yes, there would have to probably be some funding available to start new corporations. Corporations aren't themselves going to make the changes necessary of their own accord, because of the way they're set up for the most part as, profit seeking at the expense of the workers or via the directing workers. And so it really would be required that these be new ventures for the most part. But I think that people would be motivated in this direction if they thought it was a possibility, because I do think that people like to have control over their lives, and they just don't think it's possible in economic life. But it is possible because it exists around the world, and it's been tried. And I don't think you need a revolution to get there, because each of these new forms of new cooperative or worker-managed firms would still be profit-seeking in a market economy. But it would be the first step towards more cooperation in economic life and more opportunities for democracy. So, yeah, there are various models for what it would look like, but yeah, it would require changes. It's possible for existing companies to voluntarily engage in what they call participative management. This is a business school version. And that's good. It's better than nothing, but it's not what I have in mind because it is too much at the discretion of bosses still. So, but it's better than nothing. And it's a outgrowth of the stakeholder movement in business schools and so forth, where you try to regard the workers as one of the stakeholders and you try to take account of their views. But I suggest that it's not enough for a boss to take account of the views of workers. They actually have to hear from the workers. So in a more democratic form.
Would you like to follow up?
Yeah, go on, please.
Yeah.
So thank you for your answer. So let's say in regards to educating people about the democratic processes and then requiring education in order to effectively participate in those frameworks that you propose, wouldn't that extend outside of, because in my thinking, how would someone want to participate or effectively participate in something if they don't necessarily have the critical thinking or mechanisms to participate in those things? So what would have to be done about like education systems or public caucuses or things like that, so that now people have the vocabulary and the impetus to go and do it in their workplaces? Like I'm thinking about like low-skilled immigrants, people that can't speak English, let's say in the American context that are still American citizens. Like how would they go about making it accessible for those individuals?
Yeah, I think you're right that would be an important direction to move in at the same time. That was kind of included in my third element, which does involve critical thinking. Would be great to teach more of it in schools rather than just conveying the content of ideas to people, getting them to think for themselves. But there is a motivation in that workers would have, because if the company is still profit seeking, they would be motivated to and it would work differently, because they wouldn't get they would divide the profits after reinvesting some of them in the business. They would divide it, so it would be in their interest to take part. They'd certainly be motivated to take part, because what they received would be dependent on the decisions, the collective decisions, or the managers whom they would have some role in appointing. So I think there would be a lot of motivation to take part. And you're right, though, that it would be important to offer, a fine critical education to everyone, to get everyone up to speed there. So it's not like you should wait until you do them. Yeah, I think you have to do both of these things at the same time. But you raise very good points, so thank you.
You're satisfied? Great, thank you. So I think we can turn to Madeleine, one of our faculty members who's online.
Hey there. Thanks for your talk, Carol. I wanted to invite you to say more about the role of solidarity So as you noted, you can't be in solidarity with everyone. And what I'm wondering about is whether you think we might already find this widely in politics, but where much of the conflict and maybe even it helps to polarize people on certain issues just comes from the differences in groups people are in solidarity with. So the Israel-Palestine conflict is a really good example, as is the case of the immigration debate in the US, where you have some groups in solidarity with undocumented immigrants and others in solidarity with US taxpayers who view themselves as subsidizing services provided to these groups. So are these cases that illustrate that solidarity is in fact alive and well amongst democratic citizens, or do they illustrate that sometimes solidarity can add to polarization, or has something gone wrong and these aren't genuine cases of solidarity?
Oh, that's such a hard question, and very interesting. I really have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah, I'm not sure what is your takeaway, that it already exists sufficiently? Yeah, but it's not generalized, that's for sure. And it's not necessarily, in some cases it is in the service of justice. I see solidarity as aiming at justice. A lot of the solidarity groups, like civil society organizations, see themselves as alleviating suffering, which is legitimate too, but it needs to be, there's a problem though with some of the solidarity groups, like a neo-Nazi solidarity group is not the kind that we really want to encourage. So I think that I have written a little bit about making that distinction and how you can be critical of these nefarious uses of solidarity. But I don't think that the kinds of solidarity that are needed are that common. I wish they were. Europe is always very worried about cultivating solidarity, among its different nation states and sort of towards the future, because you have to be willing to sacrifice to some degree some of your own immediate advantage. So the kinds of solidarity that I most admire are the social movement kinds oriented to justice. But it's true that people may have a very different conception of what justice is, which is a problem. So that's why it's such a complex question. It's like heavy duty as to whether they have to aim at, they don't have to share, I think, a conception of justice. They don't have to agree, but they do. It does have to be inclusive enough so that it can not exclude, in a systematic way, groups of people. And that's difficult because most of the solidarity groups that exist, including on small scale of, groups of friends or families and so forth, are pretty exclusionary, and they don't necessarily extrapolate to other groups on a broader level. And that's a challenge as to how you can get people to go beyond the particular group that they favor. I don't think that nobody has to feel solidarity with everyone, but it shouldn't be like ruled out in certain contexts, for example, with respect to climate change and the threat to the human, So it's very complicated and very interesting question.
Thank you.
You don't want to follow up, Madeleine?
I think Carol said a lot of things to sort of start to try and disentangle it. But I guess, as you were gesturing towards in some of your comments, it seems like there's a sense in which solidarity can lead you to just sort of uncritically support a certain group.
That's right.
without really considering. So thinking in terms of,
And excluding others.
if you're trying to support the interests of a family member, even if they're in the wrong, loyalty might cause you to sort of overlook the ways in which that person is in the wrong. And we can extend that to certain groups. And so it's sort of, it kind of, I think the notion of solidarity that you're using, I can see that already you're disentangling it from kind of ideas of tribalism and affiliation and stuff. So I think that's exactly the right way to go.
I would say that I've introduced a distinction between what I call unitary solidarity and networking solidarity. And that people think of solidarity in terms of the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. And that's the kind of paradigmatic unitary solidarity. But there's also networking solidarity, which is a newer form that's manifested in social movements, often transnational, and civil society organizations linking up with each other, where they don't necessarily all aim at the same thing, but they try to support each other. They try to, and I derive that from labor solidarity in the first place, but and I think this idea of networking does open up the concept of solidarity, so that it should be within a universalistic intent. It should be, it can be narrowly focused, but it has to be open and consistent with participating with others, provided the aim is justice and not injustice, and not exclusionary in a very negative way. So, yeah.
Are there any other students who'd like to ask a question? Yes, please, come on.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. I noticed that a lot of the points you talk about in your presentation kind of bring up points about fosterization of community and kind of socialist tendencies. But I noticed that a lot of those points are kind of similar to like a lot of indigenous ways of governance and how we go about our fosterization of a community. And so my question was, with these relations between indigenous peoples and democratic institutions, do you think they could be fostered on an international scale?
How? That sounds great. How?
Yeah, how?
I'm asking you.
How or if?
No, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean on an international scale. Yeah, well, there's a lot of turning now to indigenous understandings, especially perhaps in terms of the relation to the land, because we see that we're messing up our relation to the land very badly. And we could learn from some of the alternative that are sort of within indigenous philosophies and approaches to community and to the land. They operate often with a much more relational ontology, you could say, a much more of an understanding of the interrelations among people and of their relations to nature and their history. And I certainly am sympathetic with that. As to how it would be extended internationally, I don't know. That's a really important question. And a good challenge. I don't know that any particular perspective really ought to be like extended in the sense that to take over, because there's going to be a plurality of understandings internationally, which is a good thing. That, we don't necessarily have to have everyone agree on philosophies or on perspectives, but certainly to adopt a more the understanding of our relations with each other and with nature as not merely a collection of individuals, but as interrelatedness, as has been developed by indigenous thought, is a really important direction. And I think it sets a challenge for future thinking about things as to how we can incorporate it and move to. It's interesting in terms of the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on U.S. democracy via Jefferson, he was very influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy. And now we should, and then we developed this democracy that kind of in part lost sight of some of the insights. So both at the national scale and internationally, it would be an important direction. But I really don't know exactly what it should look like. Thank you, though. That's really suggestive. If you have any thoughts, I'd be glad to hear them as to what you think it would look like to extend it.
No, because it was kind of interesting though, because when you're talking, because like a lot of the points that you bring up are like, some of the points are like ways of teaching that like my grandma taught me and like a bunch of other my cousins. And so like, you got to have like that solidarity and that unity and like, especially like in the workforce, you see that like with a lot of like modern Indigenous workplace I noticed that like you said with the example of the workplace solidarity and like how like it should be kind of level between all the workers. A lot of like modern Indigenous workplaces do something similar where it's like you don't exactly have like a necessary top to bottom hierarchy, but instead it's like.
It sounds fascinating. I would love some references if you could send them to me.
So thanks, Carol, for a very inspiring talk. And I agree with all of it. I have a couple of questions, though. One is you're somewhat critical of the democratic innovations literature, which I'm going to be talking about. But this literature is kind of focused on the pathways, like how do you get to some of these places? And I guess the kind of bumper sticker idea here would be it follows the old, the bumper sticker, if you want peace, work for justice. If you've seen that one around, it's been around for 20 years or something like that. So there's another bumper sticker that should go with it, which is if you want justice, work for democracy. And it seems to me that the democratic innovations literature is very much focused on that kind of second bumper sticker. How do you get to more empathy? Well, one of the ways you do this would be through designing institutions that are not, say, self-selected. Just use the one idea, deliberative mini-publics, which are kind of randomly selected bodies. In this case, people are coming together and getting to know one another who wouldn't join the same social movement, don't come from the same neighborhoods, have different political affiliations. And once they begin to talk to one another, they find out that, you've got the same kind of kid problems that I do, and so on and so forth. And empathy begins to build, but it would be very hard to find that pathway to empathy that is inclusive rather than exclusive without that kind of institutional engineering. It might be that, well-designed public school systems work in much the same way. So I think that, in Canada, the public school systems do much more of this than they do in most U.S. urban areas, probably, again, because there's more self-selection. So I guess I would like to know whether the proposals that you have don't fall to the same kind of critique that you made of, say, civil discourse or even the democratic innovations idea. That is, you still need pathways to get from where we are now to where you would like to be. So that's one question. And I don't want to overload this because we need a little bit of a break. But your critique of capitalism, which I certainly agree with, does raise the questions of alternatives. You begin in one of your comments to talk about alternatives. And what I think you were saying is either very limited capitalism or no capitalism, but yes, we need markets. And so is that where you are going, toward a kind of market socialist society, where markets resolve problems of capital formation, high degrees of complexity, innovation, so on, everything that modern economies need to solve to work? Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, those are both very interesting points. So I want to thank you for those. I wanted to emphasize in respect to the first point that did not mean to suggest that I'm critical of even of the civil discourse emphasis, let alone the democratic innovations. I just was arguing that they're insufficient in the sense that they haven't, especially the bear call for civil discourse, let's be civil, is really pretty empty. And, it seems that people just say it and that it has no impact at all. Whereas what you're talking about are actually proposals that could make a difference. And I'm very sympathetic to them. I just don't think that they're sufficient for really addressing the crisis that we face. But of course, I'll listen to your own talk and can be convinced otherwise. And it's true that we would still need mechanisms or methods for enhancing people's willingness to participate in economic contexts and in other contexts as well. And so they would have a role there too. And I just endorse them. I think they're great, except that I don't think they're sufficient, because this whole sphere of economic life, especially, and as well as the sphere of some families, are left the sphere to power and asymmetric power. And I don't see that that select instances of people talking with each other are themselves sufficient for overcoming that power, which is structural and institutionalized, and in the legal through law as well. So that would be the response there. And about markets, my preference for them is not with respect to markets and labor, but only with respect to markets and consumer goods. I'm against having a market in labor, which is the core of the socialist idea that we would get rid of that. But I'm also, a person that my formation was very much during the Cold War. And I visited and had, just potatoes was on the menu when I went to the Soviet Union or I went to Poland. We got to avoid that. So in the short term, I would argue for markets for consumer goods. As to whether it might be possible to have new forms for planning, I'm frightened about planning because of that experience. But if we had new forms of it that are facilitated by new forms of technology and AI, where we can have like an Amazon experience and just produce the stuff on demand when we, maybe it's possible to envision something else. But I am not trying to be utopian or idealistic. And so in the shorter term, my proposal is workplace democracy in the context of firms that still are, as collectives, still profit-seeking, but not in terms of the allocation of wages and salaries, which would be democratically mediated in various ways. And so there wouldn't be bosses. There would be managers accountable to workers. So that's a much more modest proposal, and it's only for the short term or envisionable right now, but perhaps there are other possibilities for the future. It's true that even market and consumer goods has its drawback, this endless commodification and tendency to instrumentalize those with whom we make contact. And so that's not desirable even, but I don't see a way to make a completely comprehensive or radical change. I'm more of an incrementalist, but it would still be substantial change to get rid of the market and labor.
Satisfied? Okay, so if you'll bear with me if it would allow one more question, Carol. I had a bunch of questions, mostly mean objections based on what the actual bases of cooperation are. But one of my colleagues had a question, and I feel that as the organizer, I shouldn't pirate the last question. I shouldn't just steal.
No, I want to hear yours. You gotta
maybe I can send you a long, angry email about all the
angry.
And yes, deeply enraged, as you can tell from my demeanor. So please, Jeff, Jeff's one of our faculty members, just like Madeleine. So he wanted to ask a question. I feel like I should cede.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I'm sorry to be stealing the mean questions from Renaud's mouth. So I'll try to make this mean if I can. But my question is just about the possibility that workplace democracy might make polarization worse. And my sense is that if empirically we end up in capitalism currently without workplace democracy, workplaces are generally speaking, or at least actually I think we increasingly do see more polarization in workplaces and companies politicizing themselves to an extent. But for much of the 20th century, at least, capitalism has held that good business involves serving everybody in different political points of view, right? Workplace democracy does have the potential, at least, to make the workplace itself, by making it more democratic, more political, and perhaps accelerating trends we might already be seeing somewhat with firms and different groups becoming more politicized. And my question is, isn't it empirically pretty plausible that workplace democracy might increase polarization in the workplace, and that might make polarization worse overall within our democratic orders?
Well, that's interesting because the empirical studies don't support that idea at all. Mondragon has been studied extensively, and there's way more cooperation. I mean, I actually visited and toured the washing machine factory, where they each have 2-hour shifts and they, exchange jobs after 2 hours. And then the level of cooperation and friendliness was very impressive, much, I'm sure, way superior to any manufacturing that isn't of that sort. And in addition, they have all these rules, and it's mostly a question of giving people opportunities of input at different stages, because they do elect their managers, but the managers come back to the workers at various stages. So if it was a complete structure from the ground up where everything has to be decided by everyone, it would probably be chaotic, but as well as potentially politicized, though I'm not sure. The constraint, and also the studies of co-ops show way more cooperation, cooperative tendencies, and happiness levels of satisfaction. Because people are also in this together. They're engaged in a common activity. They're doing something together. Whereas with current workplaces where it's under the control of others, it's true they can all complain about the boss. So that could yield a certain kind of solidarity among the workers, because they're all, equally under the thumb of the bosses. But where people are engaged in a common project and it's got a very defined set of ends, their livelihood also depends on it. And so some of the unnecessary hostility you'd think would be dispensed with, because they really want to succeed.
So I want to ask a follow-up about
managers. You'd need some talent there among managers, but
can I ask a quick follow-up about the study you're talking about? I'm not familiar with it, but I just think Nolan McCarty political scientist like him who studies polarization, might say, or might want to know, was the study of the cooperative partisanship or polarization within the cooperative done in a context where there is wider polarization?
Well, no, that's a factor, because the most successful one, Mondragon, it comes from a region of of Spain that has a long history of communal decision-making. So it's undoubtedly the case that it's facilitated by practices that people have grown up with. And so that isn't necessarily generalizable. But the co-ops are all over the world. And, it's plausible to think that they would get along better because they're all unified by their need to succeed around their aim of, and so they help each other a lot. So I don't see why it would be, I don't see why you think, I mean, if you believe that the cause of polarization is that people have opportunities to discuss, and that's what's led to it, I don't see that as one of the main causes of contemporary polarization.
Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you very much for answering.
But I mean, I'd be interested to hear your own analysis of why, what the cause is and therefore why it would extrapolate.
Well,
but just
I don't
saying
have any analysis. I just wanted to hear yours. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure of the full answer. I'll have to think about it some more. Good
Okay,
question.
well, thank you very much, Carol.